I went the traditional path. So I studied computer science in university. Then I graduated with a bachelor's in computer science, and then I went on to work as a software engineer for a startup. This lasted roughly a year. Unfortunately, I was laid off during like the time where a lot of companies were laying off people. So it was only then I started making YouTube tutorials on how to make games in JavaScript. So while I was still employed, I was learning this library called Kaboom.js. And the thing with this library is that it's very easy to use for making games. So initially, I wasn't sure if game development would be something I would really like enjoy. So I didn't want to invest the time to learn something specific to game dev. For example, Godot, Unity, those engines. So that's how I started to do some research to see if I could actually use the technologies that I was already using at my day job. So basically JavaScript and TypeScript to make games. And this is how I went down this rabbit hole of making games in JavaScript. So
with that experience, has it made you want to like dive further into game development? Like my understanding of game development isn't super sharp, but my impression of it, at least for non-web-based games, is that JavaScript maybe isn't the most popular choice, but you'd probably have a much better idea than I would on that.
Yeah, so my opinion regarding this is that, first of all, yes, JavaScript is not a common programming language used for making games that people play on consoles or on Steam. However, it's still being used. So I can think of two main examples, two main games that were really popular on Steam. The first one is called Vampire Survivors, and the second one is called Crosscode. So the things that are interesting with those two games is that first, Vampire Survivors was a massive hit earlier last year, I think, or the year before. Anyway, it was a massive hit, and the way it was made is using the Phaser JavaScript library and then wrapped as an Electron-based desktop app. And the second one is Crosscode, and it's a very complex 2D game. And again, it was wrapped as I think this one used the other one. I forgot the name of the technology for it. But at the end of the day, it's very much possible to make like really good games, 2D games at least, using JavaScript. So yeah, my opinion is that really it's all about game design. It's all about like, can you actually pull off making a good game, and then you use the tools you know how to use, basically.
Maybe less so about the specific language you use and more so how you design the game and kind of structure things from that end. And that kind of leads right into a question. What are maybe some important considerations when it comes to game design? Like this is totally foreign to me. Like I know nothing about game development. I'm total white belt when it comes to it. So like, what are maybe some like fundamentals of it? And then like, if someone was interested in like getting started with it, where would they even like kind of start with learning about game design?
Yeah, so when it comes to game design, mostly my channel has been focused on actually implementation, so making a game. So usually those games that I make on my channel as part of the tutorials aren't really that groundbreaking in terms of design. But so that's why I'm not really like comfortable like giving advice like you should do this. I haven't made a game on Steam yet, so I wouldn't say I would be the right person for this. But when it comes to implementation, and what I've been doing myself is that on the technology side, there are some limitations with JavaScript, of course, and I think that constraints breeds creativity. So if you can go to older games, for example, Game Boy era games, and try to either study them, like how with so few little resources, they were able to create like amazing adventures. An example would be The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, which is a game on the Game Boy that was released. It was like a tiny game, but it really offered a lot of exploration, dungeons, etc. So in the end, I think to you need to study other games. Like you need to pick games that resonated well with others. You can go on Reddit, go everywhere, see what people find particular about specific games, and then try to either incorporate some of those features and then make your game. And then as you make your game, that's one thing I really like about game development, is that when you're making your game, you're experimenting as well. So I'm playing my own game, making stuff, and then it as if the game design itself, I experiment, and then by playing my own game, you can see like what works and what doesn't, and also by showing that game to others, for example, your family members or anyone, to try and see how they react to certain things. This will, I think, allow you to make much better games. But then again, I want to say that I'm not an authority on that subject. I am mostly focusing on like implementing in JavaScript games.
Well, you're definitely more of an authority than I am. Like, I know zero about game development, so I'll definitely take your word for it. So cool. So it sounds like, one way to at least learn about game design is just looking at some enjoyable, popular games and kind of paying attention to kind of how they're designed, and maybe taking principles here and there from some of those things.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. And then maybe stepping back a little bit into, you mentioned your job at that startup was using JavaScript and TypeScript. So was that a web application? Was it web dev that you were doing there?
Yeah, exactly. It was like full stack web dev.
Gotcha. And what would you maybe say are some, if any, well, there's got to be some differences between kind of web development, full stack versus game development? Like, I know you mentioned that game design in particular is, of course, going to be one of the major differences there. But are there any other kind of main differences when it comes to maybe like stored data within the application, or I'm guessing the frameworks you use are going to be different? Anything that jumps out to you there?
Yeah, so maybe we could first start with the differences with using a game engine. So if you were to use a game engine like Godot or Unity, there's a lot of clicking around, a lot of like really understanding how the editor works. I would say that with game development in JavaScript, if you're using a library, for example, Kaboom.js or Phaser, etc., it's much more closer to web dev, I would say. In fact, you can use your knowledge in web dev, for example, React, etc., to make the UI layer of your game, for example. So I would say one thing that attracted me to game dev in JavaScript was the fact that the difference between the web dev and game dev in JavaScript isn't that great. So I would say that it's mostly similar. Now, when it comes to like save data, etc., I'm sure there's like standard practices in the game dev industry, but I'm not in that industry. I'm mostly like just making games in JavaScript. I would use a JSON file as a save data for a like solo game, etc. So basically using the tools I know from web dev to make games.
When I think about like getting into game development, to me, it feels like for some reason in my head, it seems way harder than web development. I'm not sure why, but I just have the impression that to do game development, it's this like major step or change from web development. But it sounds like when talking about specifically JavaScript game development, it's really not too much of a transition from like web development to game development. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I would say that's mostly right. Of course, if you're making a physics-heavy game, so you can use library for that. And there's also the concept of the game loop. So you need to keep track of what happens every frame. That's if you're going with maybe trying to make your game with the canvas element, then this is where you have more specific game dev knowledge. But Kaboom.js, for example, and maybe Phaser as well, they abstract a lot of things for you. So you don't feel that difference as pronounced, I would say. So yeah, that would be my take on it.
Gotcha. So it's potentially going if you are a web developer, a nice next step if you want to get into game development is using something like Kaboom, or I'm not sure if I've This is showing my ignorance. I'm not sure if there's other like JavaScript frameworks that are popular.
You know what? You know what? I think that if you're a web dev and you want to try game dev and you don't want to learn anything new, for example, let's say you're a React developer, you could start making games with React. Just keep in mind that if you're making a game with React, try to make a game that is UI heavy. For example, RPGs can be made, turn-based RPGs can be made with React, simulation games could be made with React, and there's all this weird uncanny valley, like this valley of applications, web apps that are slightly gamified, they seem like game, but they're not fully games, etc. So there's this whole spectrum you can go and then see if you like it.
And what's kind of like your longer term goal with game development? Like, are you hoping to one day like make your own like startup sort of game, or get a job as a game developer if you haven't already? Or what's kind of your long-term goal with it?
Yeah, so my long-term goal will be, I think I have two goals related to this. So I'm not really interested in joining a game dev company. I'm not interested in learning Unity or doing their workflows, etc. What I would like is maybe publish a game on Steam, a successful game on Steam one day, and have it sell a lot of things like Stardew Valley and those games that are very popular. The second goal would be to explore all this area that is a mix between web dev and game dev. All those gamified apps, for example. I thought of an idea of making a walking app that is gamified with React Native, stuff like that, exploring all this aspect, how you could gamify some stuff. And then, so continue in software development like I'm doing. So yeah, I still like web dev. I can make games on the side as well. So that's...
Gotcha. So you're kind of seeing, at least before you make a super successful game that sells a ton of copies and gets you super rich, before that happens, you're kind of thinking that, maybe stick with a lot of like, kind of as your full-time gig, web dev, kind of basic bread and butter software engineering stuff, and then kind of on the side, building out these games, and then hopefully one day, publishing them and having people use them and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my goal, but I have multiple interests. So I like also building software that is useful to people, like a more like pragmatic approach. So it's a nice, I would say it's scratched the creative itch that I have to make those games. Yeah.
So I run into this a little bit here. So I of course have a YouTube channel as well, and I do a lot of just basic like web development, full stack tutorials, and sometimes after I work up at a startup doing full stack development. Sometimes after like a 10-hour day of full stack development, I don't really want to go build a side project and do more coding on top of that. Do you ever run into a similar thing to where like you spend your whole day coding and then you're going to go code some more on like your side projects? Or is it like different enough, like game versus web development, that it doesn't really fatigue you like that? Or how do you kind of feel about that?
Yeah, so I would say that's one of why I picked up game development and then stuck with it, is that it was sufficiently different from what I was doing in my day job to not drain me more, So that's why I wasn't building, CRUD web apps in my side projects.
Yeah. I mean, that's that seems like a good strategy, and it's a way to like keep improving your skills, as well as I'm sure that there's concepts that you're probably going to learn building your own games that are going to apply back to web development. You could correct me if I'm wrong there, but I'm sure there's some stuff that...
Yeah, this happened actually.
Cool. Could you maybe give me an example of that?
Yeah, so I was doing, I don't remember the details exactly, but there was some issue. So I was working on a game, and then when I was working on a game, there was a JavaScript feature I used that I wasn't familiar with. But I just can't, this isn't coming to mind. But what I remember though is that I found the exact same problem when working on the company's uh, code base. So that's how I was able to like leverage the knowledge, I guess. But to reach like go back to like how different game dev is to web dev is the game design aspect and also the art aspect. So making pixel art, making sprites gives enough variety to differentiate it from web dev. So that's why I didn't burn out from making side projects.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I would say that, like, for me, my professional job is like a full stack Django React project. And then a lot of the side projects I do are more kind of Next.js, Supabase, kind of different technologies. But sometimes there is enough overlap there towards like, man, I just coded for 10 hours over here. Now I'm going to do another couple hours over here for this tutorial. But it's kind of the path I chose when I signed up to start doing YouTube and stuff like that. So
yeah, exactly. And in fact, the reason I picked Kaboom.js for making JavaScript game is the fact that it's really easy to make games with it. So you don't have to write a lot of code to do a lot of things. And that's was one thing that really, I would say, helped a lot in keeping motivation.
Has that ever got you in trouble at all in the sense of, like, I know that sometimes, like, with frameworks, it takes care of so much stuff for you to where, like, if something goes wrong, it's like everything's just been abstracted to a level to where it's hard to figure out what has gone wrong. Have you run into anything like that, or has things been pretty good with that framework?
So for Kaboom.js, I would say that certain things, because Kaboom.js is at the same time at a high level, but there is some access to lower level, lower abstraction constructs, I would say. So most of the time I can get away with like just going lower, using the lower level APIs for it. But however, it still does happen sometimes where there are some limitations. And usually I either try to, try to apply the constraints breeds creativity. So how could I creatively change the design of my game so that it still remains a good game and I can go get around this limitation of the library? So I would say this is a better like return on investment than every time you have an issue, you switch to another engine. They all have issues, by the way.
And to me, that sounds very relatable to building web applications, to where it's like, yes, I tend to use React. Does React have some issues? Of course it does. But does every single like JavaScript library and package and stuff have issues at some point when you're trying to like fit it into your large scale application? Absolutely. So I think sometimes you just have to accept the limitations of your framework and not always think that the grass is greener on the next side, so to speak. So that kind of also, and did you have something to follow up on there?
Yes. So I wanted to say that sometimes you also need to ask yourself if what you wanted to build initially is actually the thing to build. So sometimes those limitations that you come across can, how we say, make you retrospect, I guess that's the term for it, where you would think that, oh, in the end, I don't actually need to solve this problem this way. And then you find another like simpler approach. So this happens also, I would say.
Yep. And I would say that kind of skill of understanding like what your end goal is and whether like doing it exactly how you envisioned it, if that is worth the sometimes like hackiness that you have to do to get around like some limitations and stuff. I think that's a skill that applies to web development as well. I know like with my engineering manager, we'll regularly have conversations about, we could, install this library and then patch it ourselves and do like some of this hacky stuff that we really don't want to do to get this specific kind of UX that we want. Or we could just take this really simple approach and just call it good. And there's sometimes like it is worth to kind of do the kind of hacky stuff and like take the effort to get that extra few percent. But often the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and it's best to just kind of go with the simple approach that's kind of close enough and keeps things moving. At least that's at our startup, that's kind of how we approach things. But I'm sure with a larger scale application or something like that, maybe you'd want everything just exactly right. But I'm sure in many levels, you can apply that same principle.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Awesome. Well, is there any other things that like game development has taught you about web development, or anything that you've kind of carried back over into web development? I know you kind of mentioned that example earlier, but does anything else kind of jump out to you like that?
Yeah, so one thing is that initially when I started making games in JavaScript, I thought that in terms of UI of the games, I didn't need to use HTML and CSS. So I thought I would just like draw the text using like what the library provides, etc. But then I realized that a lot of like the UI, like React solves a lot of issues like HTML and CSS regarding UI. And then so basically I brought the use of HTML, etc. in and React in my latest projects so I brought them from web dev to game dev, and I think if you use them well, they make for a delightful experience in terms of UI development for your games. So.
Gotcha. So you're kind of using some of those principles that you learn with web development and kind of how React tends to make generating a UI decently easier in a lot of cases, at least. And you kind of applied that principle to your game development rather than it sounds like maybe you're using just very straightforward HTML and CSS before, and then you brought React over.
No, so even before that, it wasn't even HTML, CSS. It was like, imagine the canvas element. Imagine you draw the text from the canvas element. But one thing that HTML, CSS brings to the table is that it makes translation in different languages very easy. It supports almost all the language. So the browser engines supports almost all major languages. So it was very, like, I would say that's one of the big advantages is that, it's really, it's a problem in web dev. UI is a solved problem mostly compared to if you try to implement your own text wrapping, implement this going to take years, a lot of time, so maybe not years. But.
For sure. And one kind of interesting aspect is like, what is your process for learning something new? Like, I'm guessing through it sounds like you had a academic background where you have a bachelor's in computer science. Yep. And I'm guessing you didn't learn game development and using like Kaboom and stuff like that in your academic program. So like, how do you go about learning a new topic, or what's your process for learning something new?
Yeah, so I would say my degree in computer science was very theoretical. So we almost never used latest technologies, etc. And initially, like back then, a lot of like the students would complain and say, we're not job ready, what is that, etc. But in hindsight, what we learned there are really like the fundamentals. So for example, for programming languages, we learned a couple of imperative programming language. So mostly C style syntax, Java, C, JavaScript, etc. We also learned some more like functional programming, so Scheme, Haskell, stuff like that. And using those two categories of languages, like mostly all languages fit into either of those twos. And I would say it really trained us to look for patterns, I would say, like patterns between what is similar and what is different. And I would say this speeds up a lot of learning. So for the library Kaboom.js, what I do when I'm learning a new library, for example, when I was learning Next.js as well, I like to not necessarily dive deep into the docs, but mostly go into the docs just as just to know what I don't know. So maybe like, how we say, just go over the docs, not read them exactly like a book, but just know like what are the main concepts, etc. So you can be able to Google things, because when you don't know what you don't know, you're not going to be able to Google anything. So I would say that was the first step. And then this is where I either would follow one tutorial and stick with it. So this is just to get, used to the particular framework or technology. So usually it's the tutorial that the docs present, or sometimes on YouTube I can find a tutorial. But this here is like the crucial aspect is that I don't jump from many tutorials all the time. So I stick to one thing, and then this is just to make it more, easy for me, because the advantage of tutorials that they prepare everything for you. You don't have to do much research. They will explain the concept, etc. You will not know how to solve different problems by just watching the tutorial, but you can have you can get familiar with the various concepts, etc., etc. And then it's about jumping into your own project. So sometimes I skip the tutorial phase. I just skim the docs and then immediately start to do a small project in scope. It needs to be really small, otherwise you're going to get demotivated. And then when doing this project, you Google how to do this thing, how to do that thing, and then you build an internal knowledge base. And then as you're doing this and you're finding solutions to a specific problem, then you can ask yourself, is this the best way? And then you can go to the docs and then search specific things in the docs. And that's how I would say I learn new technologies and programming language as well.
Totally. And that sounds like pretty much my exact path that I tend to follow as well. It's like, if it's a brand new technology that I know like nothing about, first is like familiarizing myself with the docs and just like the technology in general. So I'm like, just know more than nothing is my goal there. So I kind of know, like what you said, know what to Google, have an idea of like where things are in the docs, and just familiarize myself with it. And then from there, if I know nothing about the technology, I'll go watch a tutorial on YouTube, or like even, code along with a project or something like that. And then after that, I'll either then jump to building my own small application like you mentioned, or I'll just rebuild that same tutorial, but just do it myself rather than kind of relying on the tutorial a little bit. And then after that, move on to build my own stuff. So sounds like a very similar process that you follow. And then if I'm more familiar with the technology, like if I was going to go learn like Vue.js or something, well, with already knowing React.js and Next.js and JavaScript in general, I can probably just familiarize myself with the docs and then just start building my own stuff with it. So definitely depends on like my baseline knowledge of it, but I generally think that's a really, really good process for learning stuff.
There's also, I forgot to mention, like step 0, having a good reason to learn that technology. Because when I don't have a good reason to do it, I will not learn it. Even if I do all these steps I've mentioned, I will not have the motivation to do it. So I need to have a good reason for it. Otherwise, I don't learn it.
Totally. And that's part of the reason I started a YouTube channel, is because it was almost like a forcing function for me to start learning new things, to where, for me to keep creating web development tutorials and keep the channel alive, I need to continuously be learning kind of new technologies, new things to have some kind of fresh stuff to create content about. So that was kind of my way of like kind of giving myself a decent reason to kind of go learn stuff.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of, in web dev specifically, there's a lot of way of doing the same things. And I think it can go, it can play against your motivation. So let's say I have a specific stack I'm familiar with. I don't see a reason to move to another stack. I don't have the motivation to do it. And then unless, even if you know, for example, that this other stack is more popular on the job market, it won't motivate you as much as if you had, like, for example, a YouTube channel. I have to teach what I learned. So that's a more like a driving force, I would say. And yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Well, before we wrap up here, do you have any kind of final advice to, maybe it's just general advice for developers or even someone looking to get into game development, any kind of final advice you'd like to end with?
Final advice. Okay. So I would say that learning, like, it seems our jobs as web devs is continuously learning things. I would say that when picking a technology, it's often best to put most of your effort towards the technology that is the most popular. But then if you noticed that a different technology you click with it more, or you have a more, you have an intuition that this other technology is really something that clicks with me, that I understand it better, or etc. I think you shouldn't be afraid to dive into that, spend some time in that other technology. For example, Kaboom.js wasn't that popular. It's getting more popular, I guess, now, but it wasn't that popular compared to Phaser. But I decided to stick with Kaboom.js because I really like the API. The way that you create game objects using components, etc., was really something that clicked with me. Even though I would have an easier time with maybe Phaser in terms of learning resources, this aspect really pushed me towards Kaboom.js. And I would say that by diving deep into Kaboom.js, I really learned a lot of, I discovered a lot of way of doing things that I can bring to other, to web dev, etc., that I think are pretty nice tricks, I would say. So yeah, and also as you mentioned, sorry if I'm taking a lot of time. So in terms of having side projects, don't be afraid to just take a break, touch some grass, go outside, etc. So yeah, that would be the advice.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you for coming on today. If someone wants to kind of go find some of the content that you're creating online, or just go follow you, where should they go to do that?
Yeah, so I'm mostly on YouTube. So my channel is GS Legend Dev. I make game programming tutorials in JavaScript. So yeah, give one a try if you want. There, I have nine courses on there. So I make really long tutorials in one video, but they're separated in 2 chapters. So I would say, if you're curious about game dev, I think it's going to be a good time investment.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed it.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me.